most of human history, people have parented the way their parents and grandparents did, with culture providing the cues. We call this Parenting 1.0.
For various reasons, parents began to question these approaches, and we started turning more and more to so-called experts to learn to parent. This was the beginning of Parenting 2.0. This allowed for some real advances, but also a lot of confusion as we got further and further away from our natural parenting instincts.
Parenting 3.0 is about reclaiming those instincts and integrating them with our current understanding of child development. It brings together the wisdom of the past with the best scientific and psychological research of the present.
Parenting 3.0 isn't a fad or a quick fix. It's a set of principles that allows us to engage with our kids and life from an informed and empowered place.
I'm Jai Flicker.
And I'm Deb Blum.
Welcome to Parenting 3.0.
Hey everyone, welcome back. We're on the topic still of self-determination theory, and today we're going to be talking about motivation again. The last time we talked about motivation, it was really about the two ends of the spectrum, right? We were talking about intrinsic motivation and we were talking about a motivation. Right, exactly. And then we said that we would talk this time more about the nuances of motivation, or like the aspects of motivation, the four categories of
the middle of the continuum.
The middle of the continuum.
Just as a recap, on the one hand, just being totally unmotivated.
Yep.
A motivation, just sitting there, unable to even get yourself to do anything in the most extreme version. And then on the far other side is intrinsic motivation, where we want to just do it because it's fun.
Yep.
And those are sort of the two bookends. But then in the middle is this range of extrinsic motivation that has to do with doing things because, well, for a range of reasons. But still doing things, but not necessarily because they're just intrinsically enjoyable. And there's a lot of life that involves doing things that we don't necessarily want to do, but that we feel are important to do, or that we need to do, or that we should do. And these are all the different gradations of different qualities of motivation that we're going to be breaking down today. I think it's really helpful to know that there are different kinds of extrinsic motivations, and they have different impacts.
Yeah. I think when I didn't know that, do you remember the time that we talked about it a long time ago?
I don't know.
I didn't know that, and I really felt at one point you had said something about one of my sons, and that you didn't say it quite like this, but you said something that made me realize that he was extrinsically motivated in school. And I remember thinking that the only kind of motivation that is good is intrinsic motivation, is what I had in my head. So then once I understood that motivation, that the extrinsic motivation isn't inherently bad, and that we actually do need to be extrinsically motivated in some areas of our lives. Once I understood that, it was a real relief for me.
Yeah, me too, actually. Because, well, the interesting thing is that for many categories of life, and this comes out of the self-determination theory research itself, extrinsic motivation is actually more effective than intrinsic motivation. And the example that really brought this home to me was voting. And they did this study on politics and interest, and how different people were motivated in the likelihood of following through at the voting booth, in the voting booth. And basically, they found that people who were extrinsically motivated were more likely to actually vote than people who were intrinsically motivated to follow politics. And it kind of, at first it didn't make sense to me, Because if you really love politics and you're really interested in it and you're like constantly following it, you would think, okay, you're going to go vote. But actually, the voting part is not the fun part necessarily. Like if you are really believing in a candidate and you're trying to get them over the hump, then there's maybe some intrinsic motivation. But in terms of just like going to the polls and like waiting in line and maybe it's raining and it's not necessarily fun. It's more of a civic duty, right? And following through on civic duty often needs to come from without.
Yes.
Instead of within.
Yeah.
I mean, kind of like going to the gym, like we talked about
a
couple episodes ago.
Yeah.
So I think that, that is the sort of holy grail, is really understanding healthy extrinsic motivation, because oftentimes intrinsic motivation from a parent's perspective can be negative, because the things that kids are intrinsically motivated to do, like say play video games or chat with friends or hang out with friends, and are getting in the way of them doing their schoolwork or following through on their responsibilities.
Right.
So then the parents feel compelled, I think many do, to step in and say, hey, you got to get your work done. You got to follow through on your responsibilities, your chores around the house, whatever.
Yeah.
And so then that's coming from outside the teen, of course, or the child, and that's extrinsic.
Yeah.
But what we're going to talk about today is that there are 4 different categories of or types of extrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
And they have very different looks and feels and signatures and side effects.
Yeah. And for people who are more visual, we will put a link in the show notes that actually is to a PDF that you can download, and you might even want to print it off. I mean, maybe while we're talking or afterwards, just to understand it, because for me, when I look at it, it actually does help me to see the actual continuum versus it just being 4 categories.
I feel the same way.
Yeah.
It's helpful to see it kind of listed out.
Yep.
So, should we dive in?
I think we should dive in.
Okay. So we're going to go from, if you're following along at home on the printout, from left to right. And this continuum, as you move from left to right, goes from more externally regulated to more internally regulated. Okay. And what does that mean? It means whether your actions, right? This is all about motivating people to take action, whether that motivation is coming from outside or it's coming from inside. And so this is the thing, is like, you can, when somebody goes to do their civic duty, that's not necessarily intrinsic motivation, because you're not doing it because it's fun. You're doing it because it is important. Yeah. And so it's still there. It's still considered extrinsic motivation, but it is internally what they call regulated, because you're still, to use this phrase that we've talked a little bit about in the past, your actions are still self-endorsed.
Yeah.
Or are extremely self-endorsed. You're like, I don't want to do this because it's fun, but I do feel aligned with doing it.
Yeah.
Whereas on the far other side, if somebody else is sort of forcing you to do something, then you're doing it, but you're not self-endorsed. You're kind of, whether you're conscious of this or not, some part of you is thinking, man, I don't feel good about doing this, but I'm going to do it because the alternative is sort of worse. The punishment that I might get, I'm doing it to avoid the punishment, not because I feel like this is the right thing to do. Right.
Or like in the case of a teen, sometimes it's the only way I'm going to be able to get to do the thing I want to do. There's
Yes.
often that
Yeah.
too. So
there's-
it's this idea
that's
that
the
like,
reward side, I guess.
yeah.
So this is a very common, this external regulation where it's basically rewards and punishments, right? And our whole society is built on this. I mean, or maybe it's not built on it, but it is very common, right?
Yeah.
There's laws, and if you break the law, you get punished. And there's jobs, and if you do your job, you get rewarded, you get paid. And so this is a very common form of regulation or of motivation. And so, there's, for kids, there's reward charts and timeouts or other kinds of punishments. We're going to take that thing that you like away from you, or we're going to, give you something that you do want if you behave properly.
Yeah, do you remember Dr. Phil used to say you have to learn what your kid's currency is? He probably still says it. But like, what's their currency? And then that's what you use. And
sure.
yeah. And it sounded really like a logical thing at some point. It made a lot more sense until I think we started to understand it better and to understand its limitations. And yeah.
Well, if you're going to engage in external regulation, if you're going to engage in rewards and punishments, in order to be effective, yes, you do need to understand the currency. Because if you're, if you're like, if you don't do this, no peppermint tea for you, I can live without it. Right? Or I don't know. That's a silly example, but or hey, if you on the other side, on the sort of reward side, if you go, if you do this, I will let you crochet as much as you want.
Yeah.
2 hours of crocheting for you. So if we don't understand the currency, that's not going to be effective. The problem this comes from Gordon Neufeld, attachment theorist, who we've talked much about in earlier episodes. He says the problem with rewards and punishments is not that they don't work, it's that they do work. That's the problem, is that they do work, and so it's very tempting to use them. In fact, not only tempting, it's very common. It's almost hard to not use them.
Yeah.
And so, and I don't think the goal here is to say we should never use those either, that method. I think the goal here is to have a more well-rounded understanding of them and what the downsides are. Because the upside, if it does work, is that you get compliance, and that's good. But the main downside is there's a couple. One is that the more you use it, the more you're reinforcing in that child a sort of a split, an inner split between what they actually want to do and what you want, what you're telling them to do, right? So that split is not ideal. And the other thing is it's kind of a high maintenance approach, because without the presence of the reward or punishment, the behavior changes.
Yeah.
And this is kind of how the researchers figured this out, because what they did was they had this experiment. This was like the doorway into this whole realm. They did this experiment where they had these college students come in and play with a puzzle, and half the kids were paid $1 per puzzle that they solved, and half the kids were not. And the kids that were not were told, hey, if we're just trying to see how many puzzles you can get through in 8 minutes or whatever. And so they gave both groups this puzzle, and then the college students made as many as they could, and some got paid and some didn't. And then the real experiment began after the time limit was up. And what the researchers were doing was they wanted to see if people would continue playing with the puzzle after the clock had run out. And so there was like a coffee table of magazines there. And so then they'd say at the end of the time limit, okay, the time's up, so we're going to go get the results. We'll be right back. And they would leave the student alone in the room. And they found that the people who had been paid were far more likely after the experimenter left to look at the magazines. Mm. And the people who were not being paid were far more likely to continue playing with the puzzle. Mm. And so this went against the current paradigm and the paradigm that still definitely prevails. It's like, well, if you pay someone, they're going to be more motivated than if they are not paid. But as soon as you take away the payment, the reward, it had a negative impact on that motivation. It wasn't just that you dropped back down to baseline after the money was not being given. It actually went down.
Yeah.
So...
And if I recall, this even showed up in brain scans. So when they did MRIs of people, this wasn't the exact example, but it was the one where they did the same thing as you described, but then they had them come back in another time. And like a week later, the same kids, but the ones who got paid were no longer getting paid. And then they tracked their brains and they were able to see that the reward center in their brain, it actually didn't light up in the one who got paid the first time, but didn't get paid the second time.
Yeah. So that's the thing is like, you know, if you want your kids to behave as long as they're being overseen, but not behave when they're not, then that's a good strategy.
Yeah. But we're not necessarily teaching them a long-term, more sustainable way of like how to be in the world. And I just want to emphasize the part about the split, because that is really important. And when we talk about attachment theory, you know, part of attachment is really encouraging our children to be their most authentic selves. And it's hard because there are times when we need them to be compliant for some reason. And there are many times in parenting, you know, whether it's as simple as putting your socks on and as big as, you know, doing your college applications, right? You know, there's this whole range of ways that we want our kids to know how to be in the world. I think understanding motivation is helpful because if we want to do this in a more sustained way, then we need to actually have these conversations with our kids. And we have to be honest with them that there are going to be things that you do that are just so easy for you to do, like playing video games or playing with your friends or calling a friend or whatever it is. And that there are also things that this is just part of life, that there are actually going to be things that you don't really want to do, but that we still have to be, it's like the pro-social and kind of I don't know what the other word is for it, but like productivity or something like that. Like the way to just be a citizen of the world does mean that we sometimes have to do things we don't want to do. And it seems to me like my invitation is that we actually engage in those conversations with kids at a younger age, instead of just making the assumption that our kids actually need a reward or a punishment to get things done. Like I just found that my kids, we did do some, but I found that for the most part, a lot of times I was just able to get the kids to do things by making it fun, by, you know, helping them to understand what we're going to do, you know, which is still a form of extrinsic motivation, right? It's still a form of extrinsic motivation because but it's just less coercive. Mm-hmm. It's not the controlling form of it. So I guess why I'm saying it is just I'm kind of calling attention to this idea that if there are two pieces. One is creating a more sustainable model for our children so that they have the potential to be able to live up to their own expectations in life. Second is the part about the split, and just cautioning all of us that when we do look at this from the place of us trying to manipulate their behaviors to get them to obey, and then we do it through rewards and punishments, that we do often miss the conversation piece. We miss really understanding why they weren't doing it in the first place. Often a kid's not doing something and there's a really good reason. Now, I have actually had times where, no joke, I remember when the kids were little, a time trying to put the kids' shoes on, and one of them was like freaking out, and I was really genuinely losing it.
Yeah,
I was like losing it. Why? Well, you're not doing it. And then I found something in their shoe.
Oh.
And I felt so bad because they didn't know they were too young to fully explain why every time I put the shoe on, they were like crying. Yeah. And so like, if we don't understand why they're not doing something, then we're really just steamrolling them.
Yeah.
And so that's why my invitation to people is, and I think your invitation too, would be just like to get into conversation around a lot of these things. A lot of things we almost have to give our kids way more credit, that there's a reason why they're not doing it. Let's try to understand what it is. And often we can get through this, and then we can get cooperation without having to, or the thing that you're so great at, I think, is like, sometimes it's just connection. It's simply that they need a moment to connect, that they needed a transition time, or they needed something a little bit different. And I know so many parents are so good at this, because I know parents who talk to me about things like, well, yeah, we had to realize that he needs longer transitions. And so I know a lot of parents are doing this, but that's just how my thoughts around, what the like risks are of rewards and punishments.
Yeah. And I think it is warranted at this point to kind of say that having the conversation with a child of whatever age about the fact that there are things in life that are not necessarily fun, but that are worthwhile, is not only important, it's, I think, one way to help make that communication more effective comes from self-determination theory. Because competence is, as we talked about in our first self-determination theory episode, is one of the 3 fundamental human needs. And so applying oneself fully to something, even if it's not fun, even if it's not intrinsically motivating, can be deeply satisfying. And I think that pointing that out is actually more effective than just saying, hey, sometimes there's things in life that you just have to do that you're not going to like. Deal with it. You know what I mean? I mean, there is actually a sort of a Buddhist version of that, which is, the 4 noble truths of like, life is suffering, or life is, I sometimes like better the translation, or the idea that life is unavoidably contains suffering. Life unavoidably contains suffering, or because it's not equal to it. But anyway, the next move is like, this suffering can be, in a sense, transcended by accepting it, by coming to terms with it. And so there is some wisdom in there of like, hey, life is hard, deal with it. But I think it's really actually hard for me to articulate. Maybe by talking about it here, we can tease this out. But what's the difference between saying, hey, life is, there's going to be things in life you don't like, deal with it, versus saying, hey, there's some unavoidable hardships in life, and the best way to make those things no longer hardships is to accept them. They seem on the surface, on one level, they seem very similar. On another, they have a totally different feeling tone. And maybe we just leave it at that. But I'm kind of curious why it feels so different to me. I guess the only thing I can think is that one is sort of like, hey, it's your problem, just deal with it. The other is like, I'm here to teach you how to best meet the challenges, the inevitable challenges of life. Maybe that's it.
The second one feels a little bit more like I put my arm around the person and said, like, we're in this together. This is like, we're in it together. Like, this is how it is. And like, we can do it. We can do this. And I think it's much more relational. It's also more supportive. And it also is, when you speak about competence, it's really like a place where I think humans really crave understanding themselves better. And I think it's like a place where a kid gets to better understand themselves. So, and they get to understand that they're not in this alone, that this is kind of like, this is the human way. The other one, I picture the other one happening more out of frustration. Like I picture it happening like the kid's not doing what you want him to do. And you're just like, listen, I know you don't want to do it. I get it. But get over it. Like, we all have to do those things sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's coming from the place of like it's like the shadow side almost. Like, it's almost like the shadow side of the same thing.
Yeah.
And one is the light of like, it's true. And it might seem hard and bad sometimes, but we all do this and we're going to figure it out together. And the other one has that sense of like resenting the fact that we have to do things we don't want to do. And like, yep. You know what? I had to do it and you do too. You know?
And I think as I'm listening to you, it's helping me reflect. I think there's an element where the light is still other focus. It's like, I'm saying, if I'm in a position where I'm saying that, I'm saying it because I want to help that other person meet their challenge more effectively. Whereas in the frustration moment, I'm saying it because I have a need. I have a need for them to just... I have a need for them to comply, and I'm trying to get them to just get over themselves so that they do what I want.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So
that's what that feels like. It definitely is like, one is the supportive one, and one of them feels like it comes back to, again, trying to control the situation. Yeah.
Okay, good.
That was good. That was a fun little exploration.
So in another important clarification at this point, I think that is warranted, has to do with, setting boundaries. Because almost every time I've talked about this general subject with parents, they kind of, swing to the far extreme. Oh, well, if I'm not going to like do rewards and punishments, or especially the punishments part, I guess I should just let my kids run completely wild and have no say in anything that they do ever. Something like, I'm exaggerating a teensy bit, right? And what I have to say about that is that no, that is not what this means, nor is it what it implies. It's because there's a difference between a punishment and a boundary. And saying, if you do this, I'm gonna, if you can play video games for an hour, but if I find out you played for more than an hour, I'm gonna take away your video games for a week. Okay, that's a pretty reasonable thing. I mean, it's not like some super harsh punishment. It's kind of reasonable, but there's a difference between the boundary part, which is like, hey, you can play for an hour and then that's it. That's setting the boundary. And then there's, how do you enforce that boundary? And the punishment would be taking the thing away. Another way to do it would be to say, hey, like, we talked about this. We had an agreement that you were going to play for an hour, and I found out you played for 2. And so I want to talk to you about that. Like, and let's talk about the reasons why we made that agreement. And that's just off the top of my head one example. It doesn't, breaking the agreement or not complying with the boundary doesn't automatically have to lead to a punishment.
Right. And I think that the difference between the two is one has the desire to impact behavior in a much, like, with more urgency, with more of a short term, this needs to happen now, we need to change this behavior.
Yeah.
And the other one goes to the place of a longer arc of learning. And it really it sort of like reaches for understanding our children and ourselves better. And it has more of the idea that I know that learning this is going to take some time, and then I'm patient and I'm with you, and we're going to figure this out together. And so this is a boundary, and this is important to us, but that we know that it might take weeks before you're able to really understand this. And I want you to not only understand why this is good for me, like I want this for you, but I would also like to explore it enough so that you can see how it might even be good for you, or whatever your reasons. I mean, that happened to have been the video game one, but it can be over a lot of different types of conversations. And I know for me, I had to let go of the idea that just because I want something to be true doesn't mean that it will be true.
For example,
like, just because I want my kids to comply doesn't mean that they will comply. Just because so that I have said this before, and I think that it's really important for us to not argue with reality. And it does take time for human beings to learn and to change. And I think in some ways we expect from our children something that we can't even do for ourselves. Like, if I want to make a change in my life, it usually takes me time. I usually mess up a whole bunch of times before I actually stick with whatever it is that I'm trying to do. And I have to be it tends to take a long time, I think, for humans to change. And often I think we want our kids to change, like we decided that we're done with this. So boom, we're just, we're done. We decided that we don't want our child to sleep in our bed anymore. And we just, one day, we're just like, okay, that's not happening anymore. And what? Wait a second. What? And so the more we can bring our kids into conversations and into the process and engage them and create a more autonomy supportive process for them, I think the better it is. I know for me, over and over again, that was the more effective way to do it. But it did require more patience, and it did require me to slow down. And I know it also required me to get rid of all my expectations. I hear people say all the time, I tell them over and over again to do this thing. And I've decided that, what? I have zero tolerance anymore. I tell them one time and that's it. They get one time. And I think, oh, you know what? I get that. Like, on some level, I really get that. And there were times I wished I had done that because I was frustrated. But mostly I realized, I just had to tell myself, what if it actually takes 900 times for them to learn this? What if it's really 900? I've created this arbitrary idea that if I've told them they need to brush their teeth before they go to bed, and I've done that with them 5 days, and that I've decided that should be enough, And then it's like, no, how do I know what number it takes? And so it's a lot of moving away, I think, from a more controlling means of motivation means that we have to let go of the idea that we know best and that we know exactly the time frame for how something should happen and when it should happen and how it should happen.
Yeah.
So you know what I'm saying about that?
Yeah. I think obviously something like brushing your teeth is important. And so, in that sense, I guess the phrase whether we know best, I could see someone saying, well, brushing our teeth, of course we should brush our teeth.
Yeah, so I see what you're saying, but I think you can say that about everything. You could take almost anything and say, of course I know whether my kids should play video games for 1 hour versus an hour and a half. Of course I know it's not good for them. But I just invite people to question. I don't know, because even the brushing the teeth.
Yeah.
I think if it's going to damage your relationship and your children have baby teeth and they are learning the process of brushing their teeth, I really truly believe that if you didn't brush their teeth if they didn't brush their teeth, they only brush their teeth every other night for a little while because that's all that you could do, I think it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
So I know what you're saying, but I think we overuse that we know best. I do. I really believe we overuse that. Yeah.
Yeah, because if you get sort of fixated on brushing teeth every night, it is going to happen, and because I know that that's like what you should do, and because then it could, if you're compromising the relationship and you're getting super controlling and making them hate it, it sort of gets into a vicious cycle. Well, then they want to do it less, and then you have to use more control. And this really is the problem with controlling approaches, is that it's sort of like an arms race. It just keeps building, and then you have to use more coercion and control and force and threat and it just at some point, I don't know, like at some point usually we hit our own insane breaking point of like, man, I've upped the stakes on this thing that really actually, and then we come to our senses and we go, does it really matter if my child with baby teeth skips brushing her teeth or his teeth this one night? Yeah. Is that really such a big deal that I'm willing to like go to the mat over this?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's a great clarification on that. Okay. That is just the first. And there's the first leads to the second form of motivation. It's called introjected motivation, and it's probably a word that most people, it's not a very common word. Most people probably haven't heard it, but what it means is when we take external forms of treatment towards us and we internalize those.
Yep.
So basically, if we've grown up in a situation where we've been exposed to punishments and rewards, we might then, and it's not just punishments and rewards, let's say controlling forms of motivation, and then we internalize that, we're going to be using control towards ourselves. So this form of motivation is tricky because from the outside, it could look like the person is very aligned with what they're doing, but internally they're sort of being harsh taskmasters towards themselves. And I think this manifests itself as anxiety a lot because it's like very stressful to feel that controlled, even if it's from your own self.
Yeah.
So this is called introjected motivation, and it's really tricky because it can look so similar to other forms of what I'll say is frankly healthier motivation.
Yeah.
So the simple way to think about it is like you have these external forces that are controlling, and then you internalize them and you perpetrate them on yourself. And I think that's how honestly most of our society works. I mean, this is why in an earlier episode I kept saying like, hey, we don't understand motivation very well at all. Because most people, I think, when we think, okay, I'm just going to do it, I'm going to force myself to do it, that is actually an introjected form of motivation. And it's one step above somebody else coming and going like, if you don't go to the gym,
Right. Or yeah, exactly. It makes me think about how we're impacted by external forces like the media and other mechanisms of control, if you will. Like, is that what happens? Is it becomes introjected? Like if I if I, as an example, like the gym is a good one, just be like the sort of pressure just by reading articles that say that it's really healthy to work out, or the doctor says that you should work out, and all these other, it doesn't, I'm just clarifying that it's not just parents.
100%.
So there are all ways that we are being influenced all the time in these rewards and punishments. And the rewards and punishments by society can be far more subtle. It can be like, are you going to be accepted into this group? So do I act this way? Am I acceptable? Am I beautiful? Am I healthy? And there are all these other ways, and that there's that introjected aspect of it that I then internalize it of like, I should do more of that. I should wear makeup because I'll look more beautiful.
Yeah.
I should buy those clothes that I can't even afford because that's what everyone's wearing Lululemon, pants or something. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a way that this introjected piece of it enters in ways that we're not even aware of, probably.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
conditioning.
the classic, idea is peer pressure, right?
Yeah.
Peer pressure can be very active, like, oh, come on, just everyone's doing it. Or it could just be like, I'm trying to fit in. And so you have this external regulation, and then you have this introjected version of that. And those are both more on the controlling side of this continuum. There are two other forms of extrinsic motivation that are more.
They move more toward the internal, right? They sort of move toward
they are. Yes, even though they are still. It's not about doing it just because the thing itself is fun. It is the motivation is coming from within.
Yeah.
In the first version, which is somewhat internal, is called identified regulation. Now, the names of these are not necessary to memorize. They're just there to be able to talk about them. So I don't want anyone to be like, oh God, I got to remember all these names. It's more of just the concept. For me, at least, it's the concept of
it's the concept.
like the controlling versus the internal, right? Yeah. And basically, when we say, hey, look, you know what? And we talked about this during that, sort of role play around going to the gym 2 episodes ago. Yeah. That one of the techniques you will use is to focus on the reasons why, the larger vision. Like, hey, this matters to me. I want to be healthier. I always feel better after I go. And these are so this is considered somewhat internal, because you're still trying to kind of get yourself to do it, but you're not saying, I'll give you a reward, I'll pay you to do it. Or I'll punish you if you don't. You're saying these are real. So they call it conscious valuing, personal importance. It's like, these are actual reasons that I want to do the thing. Mm-hmm. The farthest on the internal side of regulation, of motivation, is called integrated regulation. And that is when if you're stuck kind of rationalizing with yourself, it's still, there feels like something's missing. And I think again, going back 2 episodes when we talked about you going to the gym, there was a part of you that didn't want to go and a part of you that did. Mm-hmm. And the integrated allows all those parts to work together. And instead, because you can have all these good reasons, but then there can be this other side that uses those reasons to kind of browbeat the part that isn't quite ready to go or is feeling resistance to going. And so now you have these split off parts that are kind of in conflict. And integrated is like where you actually kind of bring those parts of you into harmony, and so that you're doing the thing and not feeling much, if any, internal resistance.
Mm-hmm. How does that look?
Well, the interesting thing is, it looks, I think, and feels a lot like intrinsic motivation. You're just going to go do it. And I guess for me, my work with teens, from the beginning, I kind of jokingly said, I don't hate going to work. I don't hate it, but I kind of liked it to a certain extent. But over the years, as I've gotten more and more effective, and so that there's more of a sense of competence associated with it, and I've really understood like the importance of the relationships I'm building. I just, and I don't want to jinx myself here, but I never like dread going to work, or I'm always, so there's a certain harmony there. And there is a deep satisfaction that comes from the work that I do, so that's part of it. But it's a little bit different than something that's purely intrinsic, like that's just something that's just enjoyable. It sort of becomes enjoyable, and so there's a different quality there. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think it does make sense. I wonder if you thought about this from the perspective of a teenager.
Sure.
Can you think of an example of how a teenager might be more, sort of moving in this integrated way?
Again, the example I used when 2 episodes ago, when we talked about kids saying, I really don't want to do this, whatever this is, studying for this test. I really don't want to do this. And then I would say, well, you don't have to. There's sort of multiple things going on there. They're worried about getting a bad grade. So there's maybe an element, it's not quite a punishment, but it's like a negative reward. And they are drawn towards getting those good grades. It'll, feel better. So, and then there's also some very rational things of like, oh, I want to keep my options open for college. So, there's all these things going on, but it's not fully integrated, because there's a part of them also kind of pushing back on like, yeah, but I don't, this is meaningless to me, for example. I don't get why I'm supposed to do this. This just seems like busy work, or I'm not understanding this, and this is really confusing. And so there's lots of reasons why, or just I would much rather be doing something else, right? There's lots of reasons why, but when I have that conversation with them and say, hey, you really don't have to do this, and then that part of them comes around and says, yeah, but I really do want to do well in this, it helps them integrate.
Okay, that makes sense.
And so then all of a sudden they have more of them available to apply to that task, and less of them is kind of sitting there trying to self-sabotage and fight the process.
Yeah. Right. And it's like what we did do in that role play, where we brought to conscious awareness the different parts so that I could then more effectively integrate them as well.
Correct.
And I have found that since then that I am definitely, when I'm thinking about going to the gym, I don't have the same drill sergeant sort of energy. And I definitely feel like I'm willing to consider that there are voices that want to be heard and that need to be integrated in that way.
Yeah.
And so it's really been good. I feel like I'm sweeter about it. Like that's the only word I can use. It's like I have like a sweetness. Like I'm not doing the dragging as much as I'm just like more gentle.
Yeah.
But there is a way that it seems like in order to integrate, you do need to have, you need to call out those possible voices that are in there.
Yeah.
And that reminds me of it reminds me of the question that could be out there of like, well, how do we help our kids do this? And how do we I asked you a question before. What did I ask you? It was something like, well, how do I know the difference? right? How do I know the difference with my kids of like whether it's like introjected or, oh, I know what I said to you was just that I think there are a lot of kids who believe that they are intrinsically motivated. You know, like this, I'm doing my homework because I want to do my homework and I'm totally on board. But really, in some ways, they are swimming in a sea of peer pressure, sometimes unspoken, sometimes spoken, and maybe parental pressure that they've sort of internalized or it's introjected. And then I asked you the question of like, how do you know the difference? Do you remember what you said? Mm-mm. You said that you would ask the question. Right? Like,
right.
You'd ask the kid the question of like, well, you know, are you doing this? How did you put the question? Do you remember?
Well, I don't remember exactly how I put the question. But it was something like, you know, what is motivating you to do this?
Yeah, right.
I mean, you can just go to it. Yeah, because, you know, if they say, yeah, I really, you know, get a lot out of, I don't know. There's a different quality to it's not even so much, sometimes it's what they say and sometimes it's how they say it.
Yeah.
But I can feel when I have that conversation with a student, whether they're doing it because they're feeling compelled to, mm-hmm. or because it's an expression of competence or of ability.
Yeah.
There's so many things that this is making me think, and one thing is if we start with ourselves, I think it's, as we've said before, can be really helpful because there's a lot to learn. We can benefit from it, but we can also learn about these different distinctions and see them in play in our own lives, and then get more clear about them with our kids. I think one helpful idea to try on is to prioritize, if you're really interested in this stuff like I am, to try on the idea of prioritizing the integration process over the outcome of the situation. So like if your goal is to get yourself to go to the gym, and you can say, oh, I don't have time to sit there and let all the different parts of myself have room to speak because I'll never even get to the gym. And what I would argue is that might actually be true.
Yeah.
But if you really want to learn about these different kinds of motivation, allowing for that to actually possibly happen 1 or 2 times or 3 times even, where you like really go deep. I think once the integration happens, it's sort of a longer term win, because then you are gonna be motivated in a different way going forward. Yeah. And I think it's also nice because that you use it in one context and then you kind of start to understand that process in general.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, really helpful.
Yeah. And it's an incredibly self-loving approach. You know, it's really an honoring. I think there's so much resistance to if I don't just demand of myself to do this, we don't trust ourselves that we will.
Yeah.
And we also don't trust our children that they will.
Yeah.
That they, you know, that there's an internal desire to do things that also we have an inner conflict with, that we can have both, and there's a beautiful thing about holding the many, or maybe 2 parts of us that are in conflict. And my invitation to piggyback on your invitation is to journal it, to write it out. I mean, you don't have to have a journal, but a piece of paper can really be helpful, because I find when I'm doing work that is my parts work, sometimes it's hard for me to do it by myself. Like it was really helpful for you to do it with me, to hold that space with me. So if you have someone who can do that with you, that's awesome. Yeah. If that isn't available to you, I find journaling allows me to ask an actual question as if it was someone else asking me one, you know, like, well, what part of me wants to go to the gym, and then write about that, you know, or what part of me, you know, what is the other part? What do the other parts have to say, you know, and asking those kinds of questions to myself while journaling often gets better results than trying to do it all in my head, where I can just kind of get a little bit distracted by it.
Yeah. And you can go back and kind of see the record of the different things you're thinking in the process.
Yeah. And probably see patterns,
Yeah.
with other things that we do and don't want to do.
Cool.
Yeah.
So journal or write.
Yeah, journal or write, and that I think is an integrating process just in general. But in this particular instance, it could be integrative as it relates to, specifically motivating ourselves.
Yes. Okay. So we're coming up to the end here. I want to do a quick recap.
Let's do it.
And basically this continuum of motivation, you kind of blend them there.
We don't have enough time to say both words.
It runs from a motivation on the far left side of the graphic to intrinsic motivation. And along the way, there's all these gradations of extrinsic motivation. And a motivation is just lack of motivation. And then it goes to external regulation, which is being kind of controlled by others. Then there is what we talked a lot about, introjected motivation, which is when we take that outside coercion and internalize it. So it looks like we're super self-motivated, but we're actually, it's still an external form.
Yeah.
And then we cross the midway line and come to what they call identified regulation. And I think the reason they call it that is because there is an element where once we value something, we kind of identify, it's like part of our identity. It's like, yeah, I am the kind of person who thinks it's important to work out or whatever. And so it does align with us, but it hasn't been fully integrated yet. There are other parts of our identity that are maybe not on board.
Yeah.
And so then that's the final stage of extrinsic motivation, which is to really integrate all the pieces and let them kind of find that harmonious inner relating aspect. And then of course on the far side, fully internal is this intrinsic motivation, just doing things because they are enjoyable.
Yeah.
So that's the overview of the continuum.
Yeah. Good recap.
Thank you.
And what was fascinating is to see that when 2 episodes ago, when we decided spontaneously to do a little role play about this, and then I didn't actually understand what integrated regulation fully was. I really didn't. I've still, until today, I was still having like a little bit of like confusion between them. And, but at the time I even, I was using words about parts and these different pieces of myself. And then to have it come together today, kind of full circle, to actually seeing that this integrated regulation is literally taking those many different pieces of ourselves and then integrating them into something that feels a little more cohesive and feels like it's like we can kind of own it.
Yeah.
That's really
cool.
Awesome.
Yeah. It actually, I had a parallel process where I feel like I have a better understanding of it too, having watched you kind of go through that. So I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
I mean, this is such deep stuff. There's a lot to learn. And so anyway, I guess, I mean, we're still learning.
We're still learning. And I want to just remind everyone that this is the first conversation, but not the last conversation that we're going to have about motivation. And that if anyone has any specific questions that they're grappling with as it relates to motivating their child or their own motivation, we can use those as examples in the future, and then integrate the theory in a possible discussion about that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that we welcome questions and challenges. And I mean, there's a thing that happens that when we hear new theories, oftentimes the parts, we'll have voices that say, oh, that's wrong for that reason or that reason. And occasionally that's an accurate thing, but more often than not, if you voice those and give us a chance to respond, it's actually a really helpful opportunity to clarify what we're trying to say or bring in elements that we haven't said because there's just so much to talk about. And so they're great learning opportunities, potentially.
Yeah, that's great. So even specific questions or like irritations or criticisms or resistances, those are helpful because I'm going to guess that if someone else, if one person's having it, many people are.
That's a
so
great
it's
point.
a worthy conversation. It's kind of like the idea that there's no stupid question. It's like there's no reaction that it doesn't warrant some sort of conversation.
It's valid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So thanks everyone for being a part of this.
Yeah.
We appreciate your support, your attention, and your commitment to the journey of learning how to be the best possible parent you can be and the happiest, healthiest person for yourself that you can be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I guess it's a wrap.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time.